bit closer.
Okay, here we go. Thanks so much for coming. We have
To say hello.
we have called this talk Programming Design Systems because we wanted to take the time to talk about our recently founded design studio and our design practice, but also some of the ideas that kind of influence the work we do. It happens to be that Programming Design Systems is also the name of a book that I'm writing that I'm going to talk a little bit about and how that influences the work we do in the studio. So it's going to be about the intersection of graphic design and programming languages. And since we're a newly founded design studio, we have work to show. So we're going to show some of the projects we already finished and some projects that we are currently finishing at the end. But before jumping into all of it, let's just quickly introduce ourselves. My name is Rune Madsen. I know some of you, but I guess my normal pitch is that I mostly consider myself a designer who happens to work with programming languages primarily. And I do a lot of work, both artistic work, professional work, and also educational work, and like teaching classes at NYU since 2012, and writing this book that I'm writing.
And I'm Martin Bravo. Hello. I come from a kind of traditional graphic design background, but from the early days of my career, I started going towards digital media. And I slowly started learning programming and starting to use those tools for digital projects like websites and stuff like that. And most recently, I've started to kind of go back to design, to graphic design and branding with using these tools as well. So, yeah.
Okay, so we want to frame our design practice by talking a little bit about the field of design, especially design education, and then some about how agencies work, and then talk about ourselves and our work. So I'll just briefly introduce this idea of the current state of design, what kind of workflows exist, and what that does to digital design projects, and hopefully that'll frame it nicely. So when we say the word graphic designer, I think many people think about these kinds of products, static products, such as posters or logos. And that's because the field of graphic design really evolved from the craft of printmaking. So the tools and techniques that we have come from this very manual craft. And I think that manual legacy is still very much alive in the digital tools that designers use. Even though we use the computer, you can trace these workflows back to the manual processes that came before the computer. So think about Photoshop or Sketch or Illustrator. Things such as the crop tool or the brush or the marquee tool. It's all processes that you did with your hand, and even though you use your mouse, it's pretty much the same processes. And that works really well in an environment where you do static design products, because a poster and the prototype of a poster is pretty much the same as the final product of a poster. Like you can prototype it, and the end product looks pretty much like the prototype, because there's not much of a difference there. But as you all know, the world today has changed pretty drastically in the way we create and consume products, and that has changed what a design product is, because most digital products today are created in software. And the thing about these is that the visual design that makes up the entirety of the poster is just a tiny part of what makes a design product great. And yes, the visual design is important, but what really is important is all the things that make a piece of software come alive. So animations or loading of live data, interactivity, the speed of the software, and so on. And the thing about these is that none of these things can be prototyped in traditional graphic design software or digital design tools, because all of them require the use of programming. So something that we have noticed is that You might think that design education would realize this, design educators would realize this and change the way you teach design by keeping some of the important things from the fine arts education, the conceptual thinking, and then include concepts from computational thinking and programming languages, because that's the type of products that the design students want to build. But unfortunately, what seems to happen is that many design schools have decided that programming languages are simply too hard to teach. So they double down on this idea that designers are these creative people who sit in this corner and come up with ideas, and technical people are in this corner and they are given ideas by the designers to implement. And Martina is going to talk a bit about how these workflows exist in the real professional world. But just to very simply say this, if you break down and simply say that every creative project consists of a why and a how. So the why is the concept or the content, and the how is the implementation or the design. Design education right now tends to double down and operate almost entirely in the why, in the conceptual space, because the how is really hard to teach. It's really hard to change design education if you have professors who are not trained in technology. And I think one of our points today, and you'll see this in our work, is that is really unfortunate, because there is this really great creative push and pull between the why and the how that comes with mastering your craft. That you can only really explore your medium if you understand your medium. And it's unfortunate if you exist in these static design tools that make designs for products that are software, because you exist over here and you can't really explore the medium. And that's really unfortunate, because the history of graphic design is full of books and designers applying rules and systems to the field of graphic design. So it is really odd that design education is not looking at programming languages and code and being like, this is finally the thing that can make us put these thoughts into algorithm and systematize our thinking. So finally, before letting Martine speak a little bit, some might argue that there are already tools that allow designers to prototype interactive experience without writing code, such as Framer or Azure. I think the problem with this is that that's definitely true, and those tools are really big step forward, but they are still a simulation of what the product eventually needs to be. And if you make something, you have to tear it completely down and rebuild it again for production. And it also exists in this place where there's no context. It's very rare that you get to do projects that are completely done from scratch. You always exist in some kind of existing architecture or landscape or environment that you have to build for. And these tools have no context of that. So they exist entirely on their own. So that's a little bit about this traditional design education.
So there is, of course, a lot of few schools that are taking a completely different approach. ITP, which is a school we both went to, and many of you either know or are assisting to or have assisted to. They take a completely different approach, and they introduce computation for people that are not normally considering themselves programmers or people who code. And they frame it as a way for creative people to get into this world. And ITP really is a great program, and we both have benefited a lot from it, and it really changed the way we work in our professional careers. But ITP and the schools of that type, they tend to lean too much towards the technical side and kind of forget about the conceptual part of it as well. And we think that because the computer is such a powerful tool, it's really hard that if you're not aware of that power, it's really hard to not get eaten by it and making the computing and the power and the tool itself taking all of the focus. A good example of this is any interactive installation or performance that is very it makes you question whether you are using the computer or the computer is using you. And if you look at the structures of the digital and design studios and agencies, a little bit of the same happens. On one end, we have the agencies that work on the traditional way and apply it to digital products. So that process tends to work really well for products that are not digital. But when you go to the digital world, you end up applying a type of waterfall process that you have these creative designers that design something in a vacuum and then hand it over to developers that will then implement. And they really happen in a disconnected way. And because they are done in this way with the tools that were designed for static products, they tend to perpetuate the status quo. On the other hand, you have these really creative coding agencies that do all these really experimental things that showcase all of this technology, but they tend to stay in the spectacle side and make us question why they were doing this and what's their meaning, what they are meaningful. Of course, this is a very simplified way of saying things. There is many studios that are doing really interesting things, and they're changing the way they work and creating multidisciplinary teams that collaborate very tightly. But our point is that we strongly believe that there has to be more design studios and more designers who are both experts on the meaning and on the medium, and are able to use that. And are able to really master the space that they are designing for, and that way coming up with better solutions that are both more creative and more relevant.
So I think as an example to that, I'm just going to quickly detour and talk about the book that I'm writing, because I think it's a great example of what happens when you introduce programming languages to maybe students who are not trained designers and have recently learned how to code, but introduce code in a design context, basically. And I think it supports this point. So the book is called Programming Design Systems. It's for free online on programmingdesignsystems.com. And I have taught this book at NYU since 2012 as a class. And the one thing that I always tell my students is basically the same things we're just talking about here. One term I like to talk about is the idea of the transition from design to meta design. So there's a quote here by the American computer scientist Donald Knuth that says, meta design is much more difficult than design. It's easier to draw something than to explain how to draw it. However, once we have successfully explained how to draw something in a sufficiently general manner, the same explanation will work for related shapes in different circumstances. So the time spent in formulating a precise explanation turns out to be worth it. And I really like this idea, and I think that's something that frames our design practice too. This idea of designers transitioning from someone who just draws something to writing software or systems that then draw something for you. So a meta design practice. And the way I talk to my students about this is a very simple example of, like, take any design. Here it's on the left, it's a design by the famous American graphic designer Paul Rand. And even though this was probably done by hand or in a very early version of Photoshop or Quark Express or whatever, there is still a very systematic rule and system to it. So I would say it's something like, take green hearts, repeat them in rows and columns with an equal spacing, replace one green heart with a red heart, replace one green heart with a title. And that is the design system here. So it's clear that designers impose these systems on their own work, even before the computer or in the early days of design software. And we can take this idea and implement it in code on the right-hand side, and it looks pretty much like the original poster. But once it's in code, and this is just a very basic example, we can explore this design system easily by using randomization, what happens if you have larger hearts, more spacing, fewer columns, and so on. And I think our point in this talk is that code is not just a way to build production-ready design products. It's just not a way for the designer to be able to make the website. It's a frame of thinking that can change the way you design and your process of designing and make you explore the bounds of a design. Even though it becomes a static poster, you use code as a way to prototype these things. And I think that's a very powerful idea. And so my book goes through these ideas by introducing programming languages to how to do procedural shapes, to all these exercises, to color models and color spaces, generative color schemes, how technology, like geometric composition and grid systems, and how technology influences layout mechanisms and so on. But the reason why we want to show this is that I want to show a little bit of work, and I know there's some students here I see from, so this is work from the last 2 semesters in Shanghai where I taught undergraduate students, and it's all work done over 2 or 3 weeks, so keep that in mind. But just to show you what happens when you introduce code as a tool in the design process. I always have this example. This is not a student work, but I think it illustrates the point very much that these small domain-specific design tools can really help you explore a specific area of design. So the projects that I see in the class is things such as generative covers or book covers or album covers that look different every time you run the software. Dynamic identities for print and paper to textiles, such as generative game. Like games is a great area to explain these things because you cannot simply design every element in a game by hand. You have to use procedural techniques. So here's 50,000 different game characters generated by putting together different body shapes and eyes and so on. More poster generative designs, generative typography, software to generate a tie to every sneaker in your collection, generative print projects, more generative branding made by Jerry, who's right there. Thank you, Jerry. And I show these projects, and I have hundreds of them, but just to say that you would rarely come up with these ideas if you didn't have code as a tool. So a point here is also that we've made before is that we think that you get different ideas because you work within the medium and you can kind of explore the constraints of the thing you're building for. Yeah, on to our company.
That brings us to us. Rune and I have known each other for a few years already. We met at ITP. We worked together at O'Reilly. We have both worked for companies and agencies of different sizes and types. And we both saw the need for, I mean, we both wanted to create a company that would work in this way that we were describing, that it doesn't split technology from design and kind of like integrate this process in a more fluid way. And we wanted to be able to make creative products that are very much ingrained in the medium they exist in. So later last year, we found Design Systems International. This is our website. And we were trying to build that type of company. We are very early in our process. It's been less than a year. But we want to share with you some core ideas that are guiding our work. And it's kind of a work in progress. We're not kind of like set on stone on any of this, but we think it's there are some interesting ideas that we want to share with you. One, and we already talked a bit about this, we use prototyping as means for creating. We mix this with traditional tools as well, but we kind of add this programming as a creative tool, as one of the tools we use in our toolkit. I like to think that digital products, digital products it's more important what happens in between states than what each state is. That is like how things move, when things move, what you do, what happens, etc. And all of that is really almost impossible to describe in mockups or in any description that is not an actual prototype that works. We also believe that constraints fuel creativity, and that's a concept that is very common in design schools and in design processes. But taking to digital tools, working in the constraints of that digital format, it's actually, when those constraints come in the right moment, it's actually a good thing, not a bad thing. If you get into the constraints after you create this whole system and you realize that it's not implementable because some external constraint of the project, it becomes a problem. But if it's taken early on, it can become an asset. And that struggle is something that can fuel the creativity and help us come to better solutions in the end. We really like this quote from Scott Bertrand that I'll just read. Designers love to craft design principles, rules for their coworkers to follow. This rarely works. The principles always create more work. There is little motivation for anyone to change their own behavior simply because someone with no authority posts a sign. Smart designers study how coworkers, tools, and processes make it hard to do good design, and they just make better ones. Contrary to what most agencies design, like kind of traditional design agencies do, we, as much as possible, we try to deliver tools and workflows instead of guidelines. One of our fundamental beliefs is that we should try always to help our clients and partners do better work faster. And by delivering tools, we're actually promoting the good behaviors and the good practices in an active way. So it doesn't actually mean more work for the people that are using it, it means less work. Those tools can be anything from a poster generator, logo generator, a baseline grid that you can use then afterwards in a regular software. And it really depends on the case, what is a relevant tool that, like what part is relevant to be automated and what part not. And we're actually going to show some of that in a second on projects that we worked on. And related to this, something that we are trying to do as much as possible, and it's not very sexy or the most exciting part, and it's also hard to sell in the process, is working past the launch date. Like many people think that the moment things go out to the public, it's done, but that's rarely the case. And in the case of a design process, and especially if we're delivering tools, we need to see how they work and like how they test in the battlefield to see if they're actually doing their job. And if we're able to polish that and make it actually more useful for the people that's using them, that works in our benefit. Because for branding projects and any type of communication product, the most common case is that the things that are seeing the light of day, it's not what we do, it's what people do with the things we did. Even in a static guideline, like people will make posters with it or whatever else with the things we created. And if we make it easier for them to get it right, it will be better for us because the things that will be out in the wild, we will be better. And I think it's a win-win for everybody. Like we are more proud of the work we do, and our clients are spending less time and getting a better quality design. All of that wraps up in this concept of helping organizations work faster and better. And we think even beyond the graphic design itself or the design itself, we think that success, we measure our success not only on the quality of the output, but also on making sure that the clients that we work with are able to consistently produce good design in the long run. So we have found that the best way to ensure that in the long run is to actually provide them with tools that will make it easier for them to do it that way.
Okay, so on to some examples for this. So we're going to start with a more traditional design project, and then maybe go into some of the more interesting custom design tool examples. But the first, as I said, more traditional design project is also the longest partnership that we've had. So O'Reilly Media is a place where we both worked, and we've kept them on as clients since then. And many of you probably know them from these animal books for learning how to program, but they're now this massive media organization that has hundreds of conferences and digital books, online learning platforms like Netflix for technical learning how to code and so on. And their problem, like many other companies, is that they have this huge suite of resources and platforms, and they need to look consistent across all of them. And what you used to do in the old days is that you used to have a graphic standards manual or a design manual where a PDF or a static website that would say this is what a button looks like, and then everyone who would make something for O'Reilly would take and kind of emulate that button. But what companies have started doing is this idea of gathering everything into a design system. And that's what we did for O'Reilly Media. So when we have to redesign O'Reilly.com and all their other child sites, we not only redesigned or made a new visual identity, but kind of took that and made a common code base for the entire visual design with JavaScript components that can then be shared across all their websites. So there's no more guessing or looking in a manual anymore, because the manual is the living piece of code. And many companies are starting to do this. Many companies are also starting to do what we did, like do a documentation site that internally works for all their developers to figure out how do you use these components, what are the best practices for using the design system. So in this sense, when we say design system, many people think of stuff like this, web components. We use the term in a much broader context, but in this case, it is a web-based design system with web components. But I think what makes it a little more special is that on top of just shipping this design system for O'Reilly.com, we also made this small suite of tools that improve the processes and the workflow of working with the design system. So we made these generators that made it possible to easily generate new projects that has the production-ready code set up that makes it possible to deploy on their website. So the step from, oh, let me quickly test some functionality, and oh, this actually goes live on their site, is very small compared to ones where someone would take and hack on something, go to a manager, and you need to completely redo it. So this is a generator that makes it possible for anyone in the company to quickly generate a skeleton project and try out new things and make it easy to fail. So if it doesn't work, throw it away. But if it works, you can actually deploy it directly on their site. So this scaffolding idea, I think, is really powerful. And then they have then started using this across their fleet of websites. This is a bunch of experiments that we did for them on their learning site with interactive video and text and annotations that uses all of those components to build like this new type of experience, just to show that, again, this idea of the meta design. The meta design is the design system, and then it's applicable to all their products. So that's O'Reilly. On to CCC.
So CCC stands for Center for Cinema and Creation. It's kind of like a house for the world of like the people and cinema. This is set in Santiago, in Chile. I was very lucky to be involved in this project very early on. It's a project that started a year ago or so, even more than that. Construction of the house started a couple months ago, and it's set to open end of this year. It looks like this. It is not only a cinema, it's kind of like an art house cinema, but it's also a co-work for people of the field. It's a restaurant, it's a cafe. It's kind of like a hub for cinema. So it's kind of like a very complete project that goes beyond the actual cinema or theater and goes into these other fields. So we created a design system. We created a brand that was not only a logo, but a system of communication that would work as a canvas for any type of communications they had to make. So it's a grid based on the three, kind of like split in three in both ways, following the three C's that compose the logo type. And then with very simple composition of color blocks, it gives a starting point for any design to happen. And the idea is that they will have to produce a lot of materials for all of their communications, for the cinema itself, for the learning programs they do, for the restaurant, et cetera, et cetera. So we wanted to have a system that was very flexible, but also very strong, so people could recognize it in different ways, even without the logo there. And something else, on the logo itself works really well with this overlapping with the blocks, but it's a very recognizable shape that even if you look at it in a corner, small, with hundreds of other logos like you see in the film posters, you can also recognize it. It's very strong.
Yeah, so this is a similar project, very much like CCC, as you saw before, where we worked with, this time we weren't responsible for the identity. This was Michael Beyrout's team at Pentagram here in New York that redesigned the identity for MIT libraries, and they wanted this fluid, dynamic logo that could show kind of the network between the libraries and the sharing of knowledge and so on. But we've been working on a few projects with them as technical partners to implement this idea of a logo generator. So instead of shipping, again, giving them a Photoshop file, they handed a logo generator where it's possible for MIT libraries to generate logos for all of these different libraries with different logo types, different colors, export videos and images and whatever. And the interesting thing about this is that it's written in processing, which was invented at MIT. So there's also some interesting in the kind of concept behind using processing as the logo generator for the libraries that kind of afforded this system to take place. And yeah, these are just a few examples of what that looks like when you use the tool.
And this is the final project we're going to show here today. And it's actually currently in progress. We haven't finished all of the parts of the system, and it's set to open in a couple months. We were called by the leading promoting company in Chile. They produce a bunch of festivals, and they have a year-long programming for indie and electronic music. And they wanted to open a venue for electronic music that would have a constant programming from Tuesday through Saturday. It's called Noa Noa. That's the cue we received. And we were asked to do everything for it. They have a place, and they wanted to do all of the design of the space and the communications and the branding and everything. So we engaged my brother's architecture company, Oficina Bravo, who is working currently with us on the design of the space and kind of integrating everything into a single language. So we start with the name, which is this repetition of the word Noa. And we thought, what happens if we start repeating it and we create this effect of a marquee, like the marquees you see in old cinemas or theaters. And we start playing with the widths of the letter and trying to create a playful system, but that we use this kind of horizontality. And we wanted to use there is this new technology thing called variable fonts, where you can change variables on a font in any kind of property, really. But we're using it for the width, and we're creating this font that changes width very drastically from very wide to very narrow. And we're using it in this system of marquee. So we have a very simple grid system that can adapt to different formats. And we use that as to align these lines of text using 1, 2, or 3, or 4 blocks of the grid. But really, that's the only guideline. And the idea is that they can work as static designs that kind of have a take on that movement by having letters cut and positions that are not exactly at the beginning of the page. But also, it works really nice on translating to digital media where things can actually move. So you have these marquees that are always moving in different directions and different speeds. And each one of the designs can have its own unique kind of details, but they all share the same system. And we really like the idea that this system is kind of like, it talks about movement even when it's printed, and it has it can be very consistent between print and screen. So we're currently working on this tool that is in progress. It's kind of rough, but it will allow them to create their assets very quickly and without too much effort, and be able to produce videos and images that are coming from the same source. So they actually share all of the features, but without having to go through this involved process of doing After Effects or anything like that. Also, because they are going to be producing 5 shows a week, they will need thousands of assets a year. So this will really simplify their work. And we started exploring what this could be and what the limits could be. There will be different styles of music, and we really think that we will just give them this and kind of throw some ideas, but we really want to see how they use this and
It's 8 o'clock.
It's 8 o'clock. What's the breadth of work that they will produce with this tool? And even eventually, when for special occasions or in the future, when this kind of starts to set in, we can start exploring other ways of using it, and actually this connects with something you'll see in a second. So this is currently not even starting construction, so it's all in the idea level, but we're using all these LED screens that will work both on the outside of the building, on the inside for the menus, for the bathroom, for the programming, and there will be also a screen behind the DJ that will have kind of sequences that will use text with the font that is consistent with the variable width font, but translated to pixels. I forgot to mention something very important. We're working with Wichi He, a really talented graphic designer who's doing the font with us. And he's kind of dealing with all the specific details that I would not be able to do on getting the variable width fonts to work. It's a kind of a pretty involved process, and I'm not sure how many of you have tried to make a font, but it's really hard. But one of the things that we wanted to do is that have a space that has a very particular character, but it connects to the visuals and the branding of the space, of the venue outside of the space. So the variable width is a feature that is very recognizable, and it will work in this vector font and also in the LED screens. And funny enough, there was a backlight structure that wasn't being used in the space. And we actually came up with the idea of the marquees before we saw this, but it was perfect. We're going to have a marquee that shows the programming in real time outside, mixed up with the logo. And we're working on connecting all of the systems between the website, the marquee, the programming, to have all their data shared, so they don't have to worry about loading files and stuff like that. So the website will follow the same structure. It's kind of a very bold approach on full width rows with the programming for the week and the coming days, and it will also have a live streaming of both the audio and the image that's happening on the LED screen, and kind of sharing the same aesthetic of it, so people can kind of put them in full screen and party at home or something. And we're hopefully going to finish this in a couple of months. And if you go to Chile, you can go to a club and experience it yourselves.
Yeah, so that's a bit about us. You can find us at different places on the interwebs, designsystems.international or internationaldesign.systems or systemsinternational.design, which says something about our name, that they're all top-level domains. Email, Instagram, or Twitter. And then we're really excited that you're here. So if you have any questions you want to ask now, we'll be happy to talk about them. But also, if you want to hang out afterwards, I know there is beer in the fridge. We're happy to talk with you after that. Yeah, thanks.
And if anybody has any questions, we're going to pass this mic around.
Hi, thank you for your introduction to your work. So I have a question regarding how, like, the method that you're creating this tool. Like, are these designing tools, they're web-based, or are they applications that can be like an independent application, or just a website that everybody can have access to?
I think it really depends on the project. So we tend to operate in the web space and do a lot of web applications. But the MIT project was a processing app, so a native app, and it really depends on what the needs of the project is. So this project Noah Noah that Martin just showed is going to have a lot of demands because we want to sync this physical experience in the space to the digital space. So there's going to be a lot of native things happening to make that happen. So it really depends on the project and what kind of setup that affords.
But for interfaces, we tend to use web technologies because they are very developed and there is lots of tools and packages that you can use. So, for prototyping things, we tend to go the shortest route possible, and we're very familiar with React and web technologies in general, so we tend to use those. And even nowadays, you can wrap those as an application when you need, and connect them to backends that do stuff in other languages. So that's kind of the approach we take.
Do you have some recommendations for the JavaScript libraries and stuff that we can mess around with or try?
I mean, we use a lot of different things. I think the common one is React.js. Yeah, because it kind of frames your thinking around thinking, like it's a healthy way of working, and web applications can become really complex, and it's kind of a nice encapsulation and a frame of mind, a way of doing things. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you for the presentation, and I think it's really inspiring, and especially for someone who has experienced like traditional graphic design tools as well as like innovative design tools. I feel like that's like really helpful for understanding how the workflow goes, stuff. And my question is more general, like for industries. For example, like these tools are so helpful in like making systematic designs, but like the industry and also like for all these corporations, they already held like this old stereotype that like all designs should be made through Adobe Suite and like have to go through that specific workflow. So it's hard for them to change their mindset. And also it's hard for these like traditional graphic designers to switch, like to jump out of their comfort zone and to accept this new thing. So what do you guys think about like a traditional graphic designer, motion designer could adapt to these new skills, and like where to start with, and like what are the like, main points of like changing their mindset?
Mm-hmm. I take it.
Cool.
I can actually talk a bit about our experience with O'Reilly. O'Reilly is a large corporation that comes with a lot of baggage on their processes and culture. And we realized pretty early on in the process of doing that design system that it was almost 50% culture work. And we worked a lot, like one of the requirements we put to work on that project is to work with directly with their internal team, so we could actually kind of seduce them into this new way of working. And it's really a kind of a seduction process in a sense that if you try to impose, like going back to the quote we read earlier, you cannot impose a new way of working to someone. You need to convince them that it is actually better and less work for them. And I think the best way of doing that is to slowly kind of show that it, like how it is better and how it will make their life easier in the end. For a large company, that also involves having somebody up in the corporate ladder that has your back, that is able to like let you make those changes. But when you have a company that's willing to change, I feel like with patience and kind of like human skills, showing the benefits of these new ways of working, really people is really hard for people to not jump in the wagon in that sense. And then there is the other question was more for like how people would get involved in this using these new technologies. It really takes time to get familiar with languages and like programming itself. I think the way we approach it with our clients is more than actually tell them to go and learn, is we give them tools that will simplify their lives, and they don't really need to learn coding. They need to use the benefits of it, because we created custom code, custom software for them specifically to solve specific needs they have. I think it's a bit ambitious to ask a company to make all of their employees learn. It's an investment they need to be able to make. It's a big investment. It's not a simple task. It's not something that you can do like 1 day a week in 2 months, you know?
Yeah, and I think also it's not that we're up here saying that we're the only ones doing this, and there's a ton of designers who, like front-end designers who work with code with visual design in code. I think it just happens to be that larger organizations have to hire in buckets and have to figure out placing people in teams in order to just manage people. So that's one thing that speaks against this, is just like when you grow as a team, it becomes harder to manage, and you tend to think in buckets.
Thank you.
And a small addition to that, there is a lot of people who already know, but they're not using those skills because their organizational structure doesn't let them. We experienced that with people in the project at O'Reilly, that they actually were super excited to be working in this format, and they were like, finally I can do something like this, because they felt like they didn't have the space. And as soon as we showed them the space, they were way more proactive, and we were able to show their managers that was better than what they were doing earlier. So that's also another route.
Hi, I have a question. Are there similar trends in other industries, such as architecture?
I think you have a brother who's an architect, but I think there's actually one of the key places I look for material for my book is in architecture, because parametric design in architecture has a long history. And I know there's a ton. I'm Danish, and I know Bjarke Ingels, big architects, they use a lot of these ideas, for example, for the pyramid on the west side, of like figuring out the sun's, the movement of the sun to kind of distribute the rooms and the windows to maximize sunlight and so on. So there's definitely, like, in my work, there's some graphic design resources, but there's a lot of architecture resources for thinking about this. There's an amazing book called The Logic of Architecture that speaks to this idea specifically. But I don't know anything about current architecture studios, really.
I mean, those are correct.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. How do you guys define your, like, what is going to be the constraints on the programmatic system that you're creating? Like,
can you repeat the question with the mic?
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah.
How do you define what the constraints are with the programmatic system that you're creating for a client? Like, how does that, is that a conversation that you're having with a client, and then how do you make it so it isn't necessarily ubiquitous within all different clients that you have? So if you're creating the constraint design that they can sort of mold between the grid system or whatever it is, that you're not sort of replicating that meta design over and over and over again to other clients.
Well, I think I think one thing is that the end goal is not to make a dynamic logo. I think it has to come from some kind of need in the project. So many times the variability or the randomization is something that we just use in the design process to figure out which direction to go. And if we choose, like in the CCC example or the other examples, to actually make a tool that has variability in it, it is to afford something in the, for example, we have a company that needs 1,000 posters a year. they cannot make that by hand, and they don't have designers hired. So how does that work? Well, we have to come up with some variability in the branding to make that happen.
But also, so there is two parts to that question. We're not ever pretending we never reutilize the tools that we make, or like we can recycle some components, but we're not trying to push the same idea to different people. And also, we're not thinking that the designs will do themselves. We're empowering designers to simplify their work and focus on the things that matter. So, yeah, I think the moment we start recycling ideas and kind of like trying to create this meta software that does our work for our clients, I think we'll need to quit, because it's not what we're trying to do. Meta design. That's a new company in 10 years from now.
I have a quick question. Just thinking that, within sort of a history of visual culture or even art history, I feel like, for the past, few decades, we've sort of been beaten over the head with this idea of Walter Benjamin's reproduction of an image and this kind of multiplicity of an image in that way as being the duplicate or the broadcast one-to-many kind of paradigm in a way. And I think that what you're talking about, the possibilities of design systems, is sort of fracturing that and showing the possibility for many of a variable sort, where you're reintroducing the possibility of many the many uniqueness, or each poster, like your example, could be in theory printed completely different, or each one not being reproduced one-to-many sort of. Is that something that you are very excited about, or how do you see that? I mean, I feel like that's a major paradigm shift, if possible, even in physical form or in or other types of media.
Well, I think we're really excited about it, but there's also a whole other specter of being scared of the monoculture that comes from this systems thinking. And it's something that I have talked about before, about like these ideas, if we trace back into art history, like these ideas have existed before the computer, like parametric thinking and systematic and like generative design and so on. But finally, we now have this ability to make stuff in software and encode it that creates a bunch of different products. But as Martin showed with the slide with the dance performance, and we showed with the slide with the website, why does everything then look the same? And I think there is a templatization or a monoculture that comes with this thinking that is not necessarily necessary. So I think we're really excited about it, but it's also, we're really trying to carve a niche here where we're trying not to do projects that just replicate the aesthetics of this systems thinking, because it becomes very much a monoculture.
Do you feel that the monoculture is sort of an initial phase that will kind of be worked through, and that this is sort of, because of its, maybe this style of working is still new, that's indicative of, or do you think that's symptomatic of systems thinking in general?
I mean, we discovered this shiny new tool very recently, and I think a lot of what we're seeing is, it's like, let's figure out what this shiny new tool can do, and then stay there. I think there is an evolution process that happens on like how, when you start actually thinking on what it means and what it is for and what's the function that it's doing. We actually, we're not using all of the flashy new things that are existing, because also we're not exactly sure why they're meaningful. And the designs the stuff we showed today are not crazy, like we're not doing 1,000 different variations of something just because we can. And if you look at this CCC system, it's actually, 50 options, which you could do manually. It's simpler to explore in this format, but it's not going in endless variations because it can go in endless variation. And I think there is a lot to be learned on the graphic design culture. There is like, we need to see some consistency on the language that you're building. A brand is I'm stealing this from base design. A brand is like a person. You need to feel it. It's true. It's consistent. It's interesting. It reflects something, and that is something that you have to build with human characteristics in a sense. And you can use tools to make certain parts of it easier, but you're not. It's really, really hard to get a computer to do something that makes sense by itself.
And I also think just to the monoculture is also something that comes with complexity. So because things are, it's just like building a website today is just really complex. So a standardization comes, and then kind of a monoculture and aesthetics comes from that, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Does anyone else have a question?
Excuse me. To your slide where you talked about meta descriptions, sort of as a pre-prototype, almost being able to describe.
Can you speak louder? I can barely hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. To your slide about meta descriptions, almost as a phase before prototyping, and I thought that was very interesting. And I'm curious, how do we get design schools to just focus on that as for students so that they can describe products or things in a way that.
Well, I think in some ways it's something that design schools have always done, just not with code, like thinking systematically about branding and so on, something that is taught. I think the problem is that step of instructing someone in a computer to do something, that step can take much longer than just drawing it, as the quote said. And that is a very complex step, and just getting to that point means really ripping up your syllabus in a way that is hard for design education, I think. Sorry?
No, okay.
But so I think it's about, like, that's what this poster example shows. Like, it takes longer to get to the point where you have the variations, but once you're at that point, you can generate 10,000s of posters in a second. So it's around, that's a really complex thing to convince someone who's used to a manual workflow that this step of spending more time on a thing is worth it. So maybe that's the hard part.
So in the future, what type of projects are you interested in? Like, besides the branding projects, what else interests you, like, as a company?
I'll take it. We're interested in everything. No. Yes, but no. The projects we have seen ourselves most excited about is, of course, branding, because it's something that we like and we do a lot. But also, you can think of design as like bringing the human aspect to things, to communications, to applications, and kind of like thinking on how some new technology can become relevant for people. It's something that excites us. So that could be very speculative and kind of like setting ourselves in this weird scenario and seeing how we can make sense of it, and how could someone make something useful or fun or interesting with it. And like exploring those ideas through the tools that we were just describing, and like prototyping these interactions in a way that we can actually see if they work or not and test it with people. Kind of like applying the same concepts of kind of hands-on creation to things that are way more in the future than kind of just graphic design. That would be one thing we would be interested in. But yeah, kind of going on in all sorts of interaction, types of interaction.